This video is going to be looking at the recent round of changes for Discipline Priest. I'm going to be kind of comparing notes to my previous state of Discipline video compared to how I feel the spec is now towards the very end of beta. And if the last round of changes have really done much to help or alleviate some of the criticisms I had previously. So the most recent round of changes I'm referring to is the integration of Sins of the Many as a passive now that all Discipline Priests will have. It increases damage by 30% so long as there are less than 6 atonements active, and the damage bonus will diminish as more atonements are active beyond 6. That means that Sins of the Many that used to be on the talent tree is now gone, and it is being replaced with Blaze of Light. Just increases smite and penance damage, basically. Evangelism went from 90-second cooldown to 3 minutes and back to 90 seconds. But along with the damage buff, the base level of healing or health transferred via atonement has been reduced from 50% to 40%. Power Word Radiance went from applying atonement at 60% of its duration down to 50 and then back to 60. So that's really no change at all. And Schism went from a 25% damage buff to a 15% damage buff, but Malicious Intent got changed to be an extension of 6 seconds rather than 3. Other than that, the only change, and probably the biggest change out of all of this actually, is the change to Harsh Discipline. Biggest, at least, in a change that kind of affects the way Discipline plays rather than the numbers that show up on the screen. And that is that Harsh Discipline used to buff your penance for every 100 times atonement heals, which sounds like a lot, but it really wasn't. It would, without really playing around it too much, you could pretty much guarantee that this Harsh Discipline buff was active for every time you press penance. Now that's been changed to every 5 casts of Smite will give you the penance buff. So in my previous video, the major criticisms I had was that Discipline felt very locked into its talents. You just didn't have many choices. I also felt that Power Word Shield was just far too numerically strong, which created issues with gameplay because it effectively forced you to press it on cooldown all the time. I also said it felt like it lost some of its depth, and that's because really all you were doing, like the only really impactful or meaningful things you were doing was pressing Power Word Shield on cooldowns and penance. Now, out of those, I guess, 3 overarching criticisms, unfortunately, all of those still stand. First off, Discipline is still talent locked. It's now talent locked in an even worse way than before, because I don't really think any Discipline build is viable without Aegis of Wrath. This just feels 100% mandatory all the time, no matter what. The main reason for this is that Power Word Shield really is the only kind of triage healing or spot healing or even tank healing for that matter that you have outside of something like Power Word Life or using penance defensively. Neither of those options are particularly appealing, and just spamming flash heal on someone really isn't that great either. So you're basically left with taking a talent that buffs your Power Word Shield and then pressing your Power Word Shield as often as possible for as big a shields as you can possibly get. And once you're spending the 4 points to get down to Aegis of Wrath, you're left with, I guess, choices on what else you want to do. Now, I also think that Harsh Discipline, even despite the nerf or the recent change, I still think this is basically mandatory, which again means that you just don't have that many other options or points to spec into. The major winner here with this kind of talent build is that Twilight Equilibrium is only 1 point away, and up until the Harsh Discipline change, this was a fantastic talent. I would even say Twilight Equilibrium was what made Discipline enjoyable and fun to play for me throughout beta. And that is because I felt like the spec worked quite well on a very basic level. Like, I think almost anyone could pick up Discipline and just kind of press the buttons and figure it out as they go. Actually, I might cop some flack for this because I think this could be different in raid environments, but as far as PvP goes and as far as Mythic Plus goes, I actually think Discipline is one of the easiest specs to play at the moment. And what Twilight Equilibrium gave at least in my opinion, was a lot of depth or complexity to the spec. It allowed you to, if you really wanted to plan out your upcoming globals, to really kind of squeeze out as much damage and as much healing from the order in which you do things. And that was really enjoyable to me. I really quite like this. With the harsh discipline change to requiring smite, Twilight Equilibrium basically stops being good, because most of the time you will be just pressing Power Word Shield and Smite and Penance. No shadow spells. Well, you won't have the haste necessary to weave shadow spells in before your penances and your Power Word Radiances and even your Power Word Shields to really leverage any value out of Twilight Equilibrium. To be fair, it is still only 1 point, so it might still be worth taking and you just use it and leverage it less. But the other options are that you take Blaze of Light, which I don't see any reason not to, especially if you're playing Harsh Discipline and you'll be pressing Smite often, and Penance on cooldown. Then buffing both of those abilities by 15% is a bit of a no-brainer. That also means that you can take Wheel and Woe, which is actually quite good. Again, this is another talent that really leans into the power of Harsh Discipline. So a talent build like this is almost solely built around getting Harsh Discipline active for as many penances as possible, and that means spamming nothing but Smite between those penances for the most part, and Power Word Shield. So a build like this really becomes kind of a 3-button spec almost. The other option is that you could instead go into Mindbender and even Inescapable Torment for some AoE damage, which is one thing that Discipline, especially Harsh Discipline builds, are lacking. Again, if you're spamming Smite as often as possible for Harsh Discipline, you don't have time to run in and do things like Holy Nova unless you've got full Rhapsody stack. If you don't want to go into Mindbender, Expiation can still be quite good, which again leaves 1 point for Twilight Equilibrium, which isn't bad. The problem with Expiation is that, again, if you're spending so much of your time or your globals on Smites, Power Word Shields, and Penances, squeezing Mind Blast in, which costs more mana than the other abilities, but not much appreciable gain, doesn't feel too great. The second major criticism I previously had for Discipline was that Power Word Shield just felt way too strong. Now, this was back when Aegis of Wrath had been buffed from 30% to 50%. This was also back before the 4-piece got nerfed. Penance increases the strength of your next Power Word Shield by 60% of the damage or 18% of its healing. So since my last video, the set bonus has been toned down to reduce the strength of Power Word Shield, and Aegis of Wrath has gone back to 30%. And unfortunately, Power Word Shield still seems mandatory all the time. You're always pressing it, no matter what, on cooldown. Now, the cooldown, like for my tooltip here, reads 6.8 seconds, but because of Train of Thought, you'll often find yourself in a situation where you're actually pressing it more like every 4 or 5 seconds. But regardless of all these kind of nerfs to Power Word Shield, you still don't have any other options to press. It's not like you have another option to spot heal or to tank heal or anything like that, especially one that's so cheap and usable while moving and things like that. And the third criticism, I believe, was that I said that Discipline had lost a lot of its depth because all you're really doing is pressing Power Word Shield and Penance on cooldown. Now, I would say that's probably even more true now than before, because like I said before, you could, if you really wanted to, you could definitely work on min-maxing your Twilight Equilibrium benefit by planning out your globals. Whereas now that's not really, even if people still play around Twilight Equilibrium, that isn't going to be something that you're going to be doing often. Most of the time, you will be quite simply applying a couple of Purge the Wickeds at the start of a pack, using Power Word Shield and Penance on cooldown, and spamming Smite. And unfortunately, that's about it. The only thing I would add to my previous criticism is that Power Word Radiance has also been buffed a couple of times since my last video, and not for its atonement application or anything, just the raw healing it does on the cast itself has been increased to the point where unfortunately we are back in the territory where pressing Power Word Radiance and then Penance, even a buffed Penance I believe, still does less atonement healing through the Penance damage than the healing the Power Word Radiance cast itself did. so that's a little bit unfortunate. Just prior to the changes I discussed at the start of the video, the previous build to that reduced the damage on mind games by 50% for discipline, which is a real kick in the teeth. It hurts their atonement healing a bit, especially after the 40-40 changes. The 40% stamina buff to all players and the 40% increased damage that all monsters deal or creatures deal. I have also found myself leaning on my Power Word Radiance casts more than before for group healing, and it does feel a little bit weak, I guess, to press Smite. It really feels like all I'm doing is pressing Smite to power up my next penance, not to do anything with Smite itself. That's largely always been the case for Discipline, but still, the much higher health bars, Smite might be healing like 1% of their health with each cast, which doesn't feel great. So I guess to sum up, Harsh Discipline and Aegis still feel mandatory. Twilight Equilibrium now feels worse, or straight up non-viable now with the Smite changes to Harsh Discipline. The spec feels as easy to play as ever, even though it also does feel more powerful than ever. So I guess the other thing to say is that all of my complaints here really have nothing to do with the objective power of Discipline. I actually think Discipline's in quite a good spot for Dragonflight. And I also, funnily enough, still think it's quite fun to play. But the Twilight Equilibrium changes especially have made me think less about maining this. They're just, in a lot of situations, there just isn't enough depth or complexity to the spec in many environments. If I was planning on raiding, my opinions on Disc would be quite different because they have many other builds they can play around with, I think, with Light's Wrath and the associated talents. Same thing with Expiation, probably even play around Twilight Equilibrium better in a raid environment. The 30% damage buff has been, from Sins of the Many, has been quite nice. Discipline damage, I don't think is the lowest of all healers anymore. Its single target damage is decent. Its normal pack-to-pack damage on, let's say, 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of mobs, like a normal pool in a Mythic Plus, is also quite decent. A lot of that comes down to Divine Star, a Rhapsodied Holy Nova if I really want to utilize it, but I mean mostly just Purge the Wicked with spreading from Penance. The problem is that on big pools, Discipline doesn't have any buttons to do a lot of damage very quickly like some other healers have, and they don't have a good way to deal a lot of AoE damage. So on those kind of bigger pools, where other healers like Holy Paladins will be able to pop wings and spam Shield of the Righteous, and Druids can get a lot of damage out with Starfires or Cat Rakes and things like that, or Preservations can just press Fire Breath. That's the sort of damage patterns or profiles that Discipline lacks. And let's not forget that Discipline still brings PI, which is just, I mean, it's just a huge button that an entire meta can be built around in some cases. So I wouldn't be underestimating Disc's damage purely because of PI. On the whole, like I said, I still think Discipline is in a good spot. Going into Dragonflight, it is still very fun to play. It would just be nice to have a few more talent options and nice to have Harsh Discipline reverted back to the way it used to work. Thanks for watching, and algorithm stuff.